She was 26 years old. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall in the heavy boots she wore year-round, and she ran the only bookkeeping business in a fishing town where half the boats paid her in salmon instead of cash. On the night of August 14, 2003, Nadia Kirov closed up her small office above the harbor, walked the dock toward her truck, and never made it there. That is not a story about a bookkeeper who slipped off a wet dock in the dark. That is a story about a man who'd sold bait out of the same harbor shop for 30 years, who stood beside her family at every single memorial gathering for the next 21 years. And it would take a state trooper who kept her case file taped inside his own gear locker, a genealogy website meant for people tracing their family trees, and a single torn fishing glove to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that August night. Because to understand what Belle Harbor lost, you first have to understand who Nadia Kirov was. Belle Harbor, Alaska, in 2003, was a small commercial fishing town wedged between spruce forest and a cold gray inlet. The kind of place where the whole economy rose and fell with the salmon runs and everyone's summer revolved around the same short, frantic season. The air in August smelled like diesel from the boats and the sharp brine of fish being processed at the cannery down the shoreline, and the midnight sun barely dipped below the horizon before climbing again. Belle Harbor didn't have much. One harbor, one general store, one bar that doubled as the only restaurant in town. But it had a fierce, tight-knit loyalty that came from everyone depending on the same water for their living. Nobody in Belle Harbor locked a skiff or a truck. Everybody in that harbor knew Nadia Kirov's laugh, and every fisherman in town knew she was the only person who could make sense of their tangled tax paperwork every winter. Nadia was the only daughter of a family that had fished those waters for 2 generations. The one who'd left for business school in Anchorage and come straight back the moment she finished. Because she couldn't imagine keeping books for anyone but the fishermen she'd grown up around. She kept a coffee can of halibut hooks on her office windowsill, not because she fished herself, but because fishermen kept giving them to her as thank you gifts for straightening out their finances, and she never had the heart to throw a single one away. Her father, Pyotr, ran one of the oldest boats still working out of Belle Harbor, and every younger fisherman in the harbor called him by his first name out of respect rather than familiarity. Her mother, Vera, ran the tiny harbor gift shop and had taught Nadia to mend a net before she could ride a bike. Nadia had a habit of checking her truck's door lock twice before walking away from it, not out of fear, but because a bear had gotten into an unlocked truck bed once when she was a teenager and eaten an entire cooler of bait, and she'd never quite let herself forget it. Belle Harbor in 2003 did not believe harm came from inside its own community. That belief held the whole town together. The unlocked doors, the way everyone left keys in their trucks at the dock, the way a stranger's boat got noticed and talked about at the harbor bar before it had even tied off. Nobody in Belle Harbor that August had any reason to think that belief was wrong. That was the last summer anyone in the Kirov family would believe it either. At 9:40 that night, with the sky still holding on to daylight the way it does in an Alaskan August, Nadia locked her office door behind her, same as she did most nights, and told a passing fisherman she'd see him at the store in the morning. At 9:45, that same fisherman watched her start down the dock toward the gravel lot where her truck was parked. That was the last time anyone outside her family saw her whole. By 10:30, Vera noticed the quiet. Nadia always called the house when she left the office, and the phone hadn't rung. By 11:00, Pyotr drove down to the harbor himself. By 11:20, he found her truck still parked in the gravel lot, driver's door unlocked, keys still in the ignition, purse sitting untouched on the passenger seat. No Nadia anywhere on the dock or in the lot. Piotr radioed the harbor master immediately. Within the hour, half the fishing fleet had tied up early and joined the search. Flashlights sweeping the dock pilings and the tide flats below. By midnight, state troopers had arrived from the nearest post, 40 minutes away. Cal Renner, who ran the harbor's bait shop and had known Nadia her entire life, was one of the first men down on that dock, walking the pilings alongside Piotr, calling her name into water that gave nothing back. 9 days of searching the shoreline and surrounding tide flats turned up nothing but a scattering of gear that had nothing to do with Nadia at all. One detail got logged and nearly forgotten that first week: a single torn fishing glove, caught in a piling crack at the edge of the dock nearly 60 feet from where Nadia's truck had been parked, not matching any gear used by the search party. Troopers bagged it anyway, more out of habit than expectation. In 2003, a single torn glove told you nothing except that someone, at some point, owned a pair of fishing gloves. It went into an evidence locker at the trooper post and stayed there for over 2 decades. Trooper Owen Marsh caught the case that week, 8 years into the job, and by his own later admission, entirely unprepared for something this senseless in a town this small. He was the kind of investigator who taped every open case's photograph inside his gear locker, so it was the first thing he saw every single morning before his shift. For Nadia Kirov, that photograph stayed taped there for the rest of his career. 2 threads ran side by side that fall. Officially, Marsh and the trooper post canvassed every boat and business connected to the harbor, questioned every seasonal deckhand who'd worked that summer's run, and chased a tip about an unfamiliar skiff seen near the harbor mouth that week. Marsh's own notes from that first month describe a town desperate to help, and with almost nothing solid to offer. Half the tips that came in described boats that had nothing to do with the case at all. Fishermen calling in every unfamiliar hull they'd noticed that entire summer. One name did surface hard and fast: a seasonal deckhand who'd been fired from a boat 2 weeks earlier after an argument over pay, and who left Belle Harbor entirely within days of Nadia's disappearance. On paper, he looked close to perfect: a public grudge, a hasty exit, a reason to have been near that dock in the dark. Marsh chased him for the better part of a year, tracked him to a cannery job in Kodiak, and cleared him completely. A cannery time card placed him working a night shift 200 miles away the exact night Nadia vanished. It was Belle Harbor's first dead end, and it cost the investigation nearly a full year of momentum. Marsh would say, years later, that clearing that deckhand felt worse than finding nothing at all, because it meant whoever had taken Nadia wasn't some seasonal worker passing through with an axe to grind. He wasn't ready to sit with that thought yet. Not for a long while. By the following winter, the search had scaled down to occasional tips that led nowhere, and a handful of letters from self-proclaimed psychics whose visions never matched a single detail investigators had on the ground. The physical evidence sat in one thin folder at the trooper post: the glove, a partial boot print from the dock that never matched anyone questioned, a scrap of rope that could have come from almost any boat in the harbor. Marsh kept driving out to Belle Harbor on his own days off anyway, long after the official search wound down, asking questions that had already been asked twice before. Personally, Piotr and Vera Kirov kept living in a house with a bedroom neither of them could bring themselves to touch. Nadia's coffee can of halibut hooks stayed on her office windowsill exactly where she'd left it. The office itself kept locked, but untouched for years. Vera stopped attending the town's 4th of July potluck after 2004. Nadia had loved that potluck, had brought her grandmother's pierogi every single year since she was a teenager, and Vera couldn't stand in that crowd without searching every face in it for her daughters. The institutional failure that would follow Marsh for the rest of his life was a simple one: In 2003, nobody seriously considered a man Nadia already knew and trusted from around the harbor. Investigators' files from that fall show they questioned strangers, seasonal deckhands, men with grudges, but not the harbor regulars who'd been on that dock searching at midnight, flashlights in hand, calling her name as loud as anyone. Why would you suspect the man who ran the bait shop she walked past every single day? The town rallied for months and then, as small towns do, slowly went back to its rhythms. Boats went back out with the tide. Belle Harbor never stopped being Belle Harbor for anyone except the Kiroffs. By 2008, 5 years had passed, and the dock searches were a memory kept alive only in old clippings from the regional paper. The missing person flyer taped to the general store's front window had faded to something barely legible from years of salt air through the glass, but nobody ever took it down. New families moved into the house 2 doors from the Kiroffs twice over those first 5 years, and each set of new neighbors learned, gently and quickly, not to ask about the bookkeeper whose photograph still hung in the general store's front window, a fixture nobody in town ever considered taking down. A quiet landmark that outlasted 3 different owners of the store itself. By 2013, Pyotr Kiroff had aged in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. He sold his boat early, couldn't stand being out on that water anymore without the harbor dock always in view, but he and Vera never left Belle Harbor, in case Nadia ever came looking for home. That same year, the Harbor Authority finally replaced the old dock pilings, and Marsh drove out personally to walk the shoreline one more time before the construction crews arrived, just in case there was anything left in that water to find. By 2019, Nadia's cousins had children of their own. Kids who knew an aunt only through a single photograph in the general store window. A young woman frozen forever at 26, while their own parents grayed around her. Every one of those kids grew up understanding, without ever quite being told why, that nobody in the extended family walked that dock alone after dark. Trooper Owen Marsh retired in 2020. He did not stop working Nadia's case. He kept the file, grown by then to 3 cardboard boxes, in his own garage, and whenever a new forensic technique made the news, he drove it to the State Crime Lab in Anchorage himself and asked them to try again. In 2021, he requested new testing on the torn glove. The sample was too degraded for the technology of that era to produce anything usable. He filed the results and kept waiting. Vera Kiroff died in 2022. That coffee can of halibut hooks still sitting on the office windowsill, dust settled thick around it. Pyotr kept the office locked but untouched after her, unwilling to clear out a single hook. Every August 14th, without fail, he walked down to the harbor, stood near the dock where Nadia's truck had been found, and stayed until the light finally dimmed toward midnight. Cal Renner, who still ran the harbor's bait shop, was often one of the people who saw Pyotr out there, and every year, without fail, he was the one who walked over, put a hand on Pyotr's shoulder, and told him he was sorry, as if he were simply an old neighbor rather than the reason Pyotr was standing there at all. The harbor moved on around Pyotr. He never did. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Nadia. Then, in 2024, something happened that no one in Belle Harbor had dared to expect. It would take a forensic extraction technique built for evidence, far too degraded for older equipment, and a genealogy database designed for people tracing their own family trees, to break open a case even the Kiroffs had quietly stopped believing would ever resolve. On a Friday morning in September, a forensic analyst at the State Crime Lab in Anchorage was running the old torn glove through a new DNA recovery process meant specifically for decades-old, salt-damaged evidence, when a usable profile finally emerged where 2 previous attempts had failed completely. She cross-referenced it against a public ancestry database. The process works the same way anyone might trace their own family tree. Crime scene DNA gets uploaded and compared against genetic profiles that ordinary people have voluntarily submitted while researching their own ancestry. And investigators build outward from any distant relative match until the branches narrow down to a single person. A distant cousin match flagged on her screen. She read the name twice, then called the number still listed for Owen Marsh, retired 4 years, because she knew from the case file that he'd want to hear it before anyone else did. Marsh later said he sat in his truck in his own driveway, with the phone in his hand for a full minute before he trusted his own voice. He drove the 3 boxes of files to the trooper post himself that same week, the way he'd done for nearly 2 decades, except this time he let himself believe it might finally matter. The genealogy team spent the following weeks tracing that single distant match through a family tree rooted almost entirely in Belle Harbor and the surrounding fishing communities, ruling out cousin after cousin, until the DNA pointed to one family that had worked that same harbor for generations, and one branch of it led straight to a name nobody in that town had ever once considered. Cal Renner, the very man who'd run the harbor's bait shop for over 30 years. The man who had walked that dock himself in 2003, searching alongside Pyotr Kirov through 9 straight nights, who had stood beside him at nearly every single anniversary for 2 decades, offering quiet words of comfort. Cal Renner had never been seriously questioned in 2003. He wasn't a stranger. Wasn't the fired deckhand with a grudge. Wasn't anyone investigators had reason to look at twice. He'd spent the next 21 years as one of the most familiar, trusted faces in Belle Harbor. First, understand how normal he seemed. Renner had run that bait shop his entire adult life, the kind of place where every fisherman in the harbor stopped in daily, whether they needed bait or not. He organized the harbor's annual blessing of the fleet ceremony every spring. He was the man half the town called first if a boat needed an extra hand on short notice during the run. For 21 years, Cal Renner was, by every visible measure, one of the most decent men in Belle Harbor. Second, the small things that only made sense in hindsight. Neighbors who recalled, only when finally asked directly, that Renner had thrown out an entire box of fishing gloves that same August week in 2003, telling anyone who asked they'd simply worn through from the season. That he'd avoided that stretch of dock himself for nearly a year afterward, tying his own skiff up at the far end of the harbor instead, before eventually forcing himself back to using the closer slip. That he flinched every single August at the very anniversary walk he himself never missed joining Pyotr for. And that everyone had always read that flinch as shared grief rather than what it actually was. Third, the moment the truth became undeniable. Investigators obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from Renner, now 68 years old, still running the same bait shop, still organizing the same spring ceremony. The sample matched the profile recovered from the glove with a certainty the lab called conclusive, a match so specific it left no room for coincidence. When troopers arrived at his shop to make the arrest, Renner reportedly said only that he had wondered for 21 years when this day would come, before he went quietly into custody. Word moved through Belle Harbor within hours. Fishermen who had bought bait from him every single morning for decades sat in their kitchens that night, unable to speak. The harbor that had believed nothing bad could happen inside its own community now had to reckon with the fact that the worst thing that had ever happened there had been standing behind that same bait shop counter the entire time. offering comfort at every anniversary for a wound he alone had caused. The community's reaction wasn't disbelief so much as a slow, sick recalibration. Fishermen quietly running back through 2 decades of small interactions with Cal Renner, wondering what they'd missed, wondering what else, in a harbor this small, could still be hiding behind a familiar, friendly face. Renner was charged with Nadia Kirov's murder. He pled guilty rather than face trial, and in a taped statement Marsh insisted on hearing in person, he told investigators where he had left her remains that night in 2003. A stretch of shoreline within a protected tidal inlet less than 2 miles from the harbor, ground that had since become part of a wildlife refuge nobody had ever thought to search that far into. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 68 years old. Nadia Kirov was 26 years old. She kept a coffee can of halibut hooks she never had the heart to throw away. She checked her truck door twice out of habit, never fear, and kept every fisherman's tax paperwork straighter than anyone in 3 towns. She had a future that belonged to her by right, and Cal Renner took it from her on an ordinary August night, in a town that believed, with its whole heart, that nothing like that could happen there. Pyotr Kirov, 79 years old by the time of the arrest, was finally able to bury his daughter's remains beside her mother's grave, 21 years after he'd last watched her walk down that dock. He told reporters only this: "I walked that dock every August for 21 years. I just didn't know I was walking it past the man who put me there." How many other small towns are still carrying a version of Cal Renner inside them right now? A man everyone trusts precisely because no one has ever had a reason to look closely. What does it say about justice that the thing which finally broke this case open was a piece of technology built for people looking up their family trees for fun, not for chasing down killers? And what do we owe the families who keep a coffee can of fishing hooks on a windowsill for decades, refusing to let the world forget what it would rather move past? Justice came for Nadia Kirov after 21 years. Her story is a reminder that truth, however late, has a way of finding the light, even when it takes decades. And even when it was standing behind the same counter beside you the entire time. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for watching.